1992. A young Israeli opposition politician stands up in the Knesset and says Iran is 3 to 5 years away from a nuclear bomb. That deadline came and went and got renewed 1996 in front of the US Congress. 1999, 2002, 2006, same warning, same man. His name was Benjamin Netanyahu, and by the time he said it for the 5th or 6th time, he wasn't the opposition anymore. He was the Prime Minister. September 2012, the United Nations General Assembly. Netanyahu holds up a literal cartoon drawing of a bomb and draws a red line across it, telling the world body Iran cannot be allowed to cross it. March 2015, he goes further than a speech. He walks into the US Congress, invited by the Republican opposition, against the sitting Democratic president's own wishes, and argues in front of the American legislature against the nuclear deal his own allies' administration was still negotiating. 3 years later, in 2018, the United States withdraws from that deal entirely. Then, in June 2025, after 3 decades of warnings, Netanyahu stops warning and starts acting. Operation Rising Lion, 12 days of Israeli airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military targets. 3 months later, September 2025, Israel strikes again, this time inside Qatar, a Gulf state hosting American forces, killing Hamas negotiators in the middle of ceasefire talks. A mediator hit on its own soil. And 5 months after that, February 28, 2026, the United States joins in directly. Operation Epic Fury. Iran's supreme leader is killed, and for the first time in this entire chain, missiles start landing on Saudi Arabia itself. Through all of it, 34 years, from that first Knesset warning to missiles hitting Saudi soil, one thing never arrived. A formal American security guarantee for the Gulf states now catching the blowback of a fight they didn't start. Nearly a century of American troops, American bases, and Gulf oil moving through this region. And when it came to actually standing between these countries and the war next door, there was nothing written down. That's the chain that ends 5 months later with 3 foreign ministers standing in Mecca, promising to defend each other, because, increasingly, it looked like nobody else would. This is the story of that promise, where it actually came from, and whether it means anything at all. On Friday, August 7, 2026, at Al Safa Palace in Makkah, 3 men signed a document that Israeli officials would soon be calling an axis of evil. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif of Pakistan. The event had a name, the Makkah Al-Mukarramah Summit for Joint Defense. The document itself is officially titled the Makkah Joint Defense Agreement, though you'll see it reported almost everywhere else as the Makkah Joint Defense Agreement, and in some coverage, the Makkah Joint Deterrence Agreement. Same document, 3 names. Keep that in mind because it tells you something about how fast this story broke and how little coordination there was on even the basics. Here's the clause everyone's actually talking about, word for word from the official joint statement. Any armed attack against any one of the 3 states shall be regarded as an attack against them all. That's it, that's the sentence. Everything else in this video is really just one long argument about what that sentence actually means in practice. The official statement adds a bit more scaffolding around it. Expanded defense cooperation across intelligence sharing, capacity building, and defense industrial coordination. All of it explicitly framed around shared historical ties and Islamic solidarity, and pitched as a contribution to regional peace and stability. Now, what does each side actually bring to this? Because it's not symmetrical. Turkey brings NATO standard military hardware and genuine combat experience. Saudi Arabia brings money, oil wealth, financial leverage, and the symbolic weight of literally hosting the pact in Islam's holiest city. And Pakistan brings something the other 2 don't have. It's the only nuclear-armed state at the table, plus one of the largest standing armies in the world. Officials moved fast to shape how this would be read. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan called the Mutual Defense Clause technically equivalent to NATO's Article 5, but was just as quick to say it does not target Iran. The pact also sets up a NATO-style ministerial committee and a general secretariat based in Saudi Arabia. Pakistan's foreign minister, Ishaq Dar, went further on the don't panic messaging. He called the pact purely defensive, said it's consistent with Article 51 of the UN Charter, the standard legal basis for collective self-defense, and stressed it doesn't override any of the three countries' existing agreements with anyone else. He also left the door open. Other states could join, he said, as long as they commit to resolving disputes peacefully. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan called it, in his words, a major milestone for defense cooperation, regional security, and shared prosperity among the three brotherly countries. So on paper, a NATO-style mutual defense clause, explicitly not aimed at anyone in particular, open to new members, grounded in international law. Here's what's just as notable. What isn't in the document? There's no integrated military command. No disclosed troop commitments. Nobody said how many soldiers from which country show up if the clause is triggered. No shared financing mechanism. And no defined threshold for what actually counts as the armed attack that sets the whole thing in motion. Fitton himself said the quiet part out loud on that last point. The Allies, he said, will decide through consultations what degree, form, and format of support they would ask for in the event of an attack. Read that sentence again. That's not a mutual defense pact deciding in advance what it will do. That's three governments agreeing to have a conversation later if and when something happens. Keep that sentence in your back pocket. It's going to matter a lot later. And you don't even have to wait long to see the first sign of daylight between what officials say in public. Because within 24 to 48 hours of the signing, Pakistan's own government said two very different things. On August 9th, Foreign Minister Dar was still on message. Purely defensive, targets no one. On August 8th, the day after the signing, Pakistan's Defense Minister, Khawaja Asif, called Israel an illegitimate state, said all Muslim countries must unite against it, and called for a united military front. Same government, less than 2 days apart. One minister calling it purely defensive and open to all, another calling for a united front against a named state. That's not a conspiracy theory or a hidden agenda. That's just what happens when a fast-moving diplomatic announcement runs into domestic politics before the messaging has even settled. But it's worth sitting with, because it's going to be a pattern in this story, not a one-off. To understand why three governments signed that vague, undefined clause, you have to go back 11 months, to a single airstrike that had nothing to do with any of them directly. September 9, 2025, Israel strikes inside Doha, Qatar, a Gulf state hosting major American forces, targeting Hamas negotiators in the middle of ceasefire talks. Qatar wasn't a combatant, it was a mediator, and it got hit anyway. 8 days later, September 17, 2025, at Al Yamama Palace in Riyadh, Mohammed bin Salman and Shehbaz Sharif signed a bilateral strategic mutual defense agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. The core clause, any aggression against either country shall be considered an aggression against both. The full legal text has never been officially published. That's a real gap in the public record, not just underreporting. And you'll see an 80,000 Pakistani troops figure attached to this deal in a lot of coverage. That number traces back to anonymous Pakistani sources, never confirmed at the official level. Use it with that caveat. You'll also see this deal called a Saudi nuclear umbrella in a lot of commentary. Treat that carefully. The public text contains no explicit mention of nuclear weapons. And when a Saudi official was asked directly about nuclear guarantees, the answer was that the pact covers all military means. Not a confirmation. Analysts who study Pakistan's nuclear doctrine specifically point out that doctrine is explicitly India-focused, and Pakistan's past defense pacts with other states never automatically triggered military intervention either. This is contested, not settled. Then, February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury. Coordinated U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran begin, including the killing of Iran's supreme leader during what were, at the time, still ongoing nuclear talks. What followed was 5 weeks of escalation most of the world felt at the gas pump. Iranian retaliatory strikes, Israel moving into Lebanon, the Houthis formally joining the war on March 28th, and the Strait of Hormuz, the channel that normally carries about a fifth of the entire world's oil supply, thrown into the worst supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. At the peak, output from affected countries was down more than 14 million barrels a day out of a normal 20. Some oil still moved through overland pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This wasn't a full shutdown, but it was close enough to one that worst on record isn't an exaggeration. A fragile ceasefire brokered by Pakistan began April 8th. 3 days later, on April 11th, Pakistani fighter jets and support aircraft arrived in Saudi Arabia. After the ceasefire, not during the fighting. Hold on to that detail, it's going to come back and matter a great deal later. Now, here's a piece of the timeline that gets left out of a lot of coverage, because most of it treats the August signing as if it came out of nowhere. It didn't. Starting March 19, 2026, on the sidelines of an Islamic summit in Riyadh, Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and a fourth country, Egypt, began meeting as a foursome. Riyadh in March, Antalya in April, a further round in Islamabad, another in Riyadh, and on June 21st, Cairo itself hosted a session, partly to discuss the ongoing US-Iran war. 5 months of quiet, repeated four-way diplomacy before anyone signed anything. So where did Egypt go? Not a clean no. Egypt's constitution, Article 152, requires presidential consultation with the National Defense Council and a 2/3 parliamentary majority before any troops deploy abroad. That's a legal bar the other three don't face in the same form. Add to that, Egypt isn't taking missile fire the way Saudi Arabia is, and Cairo has its own ongoing diplomatic channel with Iran it doesn't want to burn. No public evidence shows Egypt was formally invited to the final pact and turned it down. The more accurate story is that Egypt stayed in the process without signing, not that it was offered a seat and said no. August 7th, 2026. The trilateral pact is signed, Egypt notably absent, but per Fiden's own later statement, still considered a natural partner, expected to join in the next phase. Here's a question worth asking out loud. Why Mecca? Not Riyadh, the actual seat of Saudi government, Mecca, Islam's holiest city. One reading, and it's a well-sourced one. This is Mohammed bin Salman, in his role as custodian of the two holy mosques, using the venue to sell what is fundamentally a hard security arrangement as something closer to Islamic solidarity. And there's a reason he might need that framing. MBS's own Vision 2030 reforms, reopened cinemas, mixed-gender concerts, a reduced role for the religious police, have genuinely unsettled parts of Saudi Arabia's clerical establishment and its more conservative public, who see a leadership that looks less interested in religious authority and more interested in Western approval. Signing a defense pact in Mecca, wrapped in the language of Islamic Brotherhood, is a way of answering that criticism before it's fully spoken. But there's more behind this than optics, and it's worth naming plainly because a lot of coverage treats "why now?" as if the war alone explains it. Turkey's own government says this predates the war. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan on the record. Preparations for this logical for Turkey either. Turkish drone maker Baykar signed its largest ever export deal with Saudi Arabia, Akinsai combat drones. Ankara has a real, concrete commercial stake in deepening this relationship, on top of whatever it gets diplomatically. Saudi Arabia, for its part, isn't relying on this pact alone either. There's a live, occasionally tense 2026 negotiation between Riyadh and Washington over U.S. civil nuclear cooperation. And China is openly discussed by analysts as Saudi Arabia's fallback if that negotiation doesn't give the kingdom the terms it wants. That's real leverage Riyadh can point to at the table with the U.S., independent of anything signed in Mecca. And Pakistan's calculus has a precedent worth flagging right now, because it's going to pay off later. In April 2015, Pakistan's own parliament refused a direct Saudi request to send troops into the Yemen war. That's 11 years of a pattern, financially and rhetorically close to Riyadh, genuinely reluctant to put its own soldiers into someone else's fight. Keep that in mind, because in 2026, the exact same thing happened again. One more honest note before we move on. No source anywhere in this research turned up evidence of parliamentary debate, a ratification vote, or public consultation preceding the signing in any of the three countries. This was an executive and military-level decision, not a legislated one. Before we get to whether this pact has actually been tested, it's worth being honest about whether it could even function militarily if it had to. Turkey runs NATO standard equipment. Saudi Arabia runs a mix heavily American. Pakistan runs a mix that's increasingly Chinese. 3 different supply chains, 3 different training doctrines, 3 different command cultures, and no shared command structure written into the pact at all. That's not a minor logistics footnote. It's the difference between an alliance that can fight together and an alliance that can only stand next to each other in photographs. There's a quieter version of that same problem worth naming, because it's easy to miss, and every real military alliance has had to solve it. What language do these 3 militaries actually coordinate in? NATO didn't leave this to chance. It standardized on English and French as official working languages from the outset, backed by decades of shared doctrine and dedicated interoperability training built specifically for that purpose. This pact has none of that publicly on record. Turkish, Arabic, and Urdu are 3 different national languages with no natural shared tongue at the political or military level today. A real contrast with the old Islamic caliphates, where Arabic and Persian functioned as genuine administrative lingua francas across exactly this region. Whether English becomes the default working language by convention, the way it has in so much of international aviation and diplomacy, or whether this becomes its own friction point, is a real open question. And as of this recording, there's no public reporting on how the new Secretariat plans to handle it at all. Here's a deeper structural problem, and it's not speculation. It has a name in political science: coup-proofing. It's a documented pattern in the academic literature, tracing back to research published in the journal International Security in 1999, describing how Middle Eastern monarchies deliberately keep their own militaries fragmented and under-institutionalized, specifically so no general ever gets popular or unified enough to threaten the throne. Saudi Arabia is a textbook case. The National Guard is kept structurally separate from the regular army as a built-in counterweight. Commanders rotate constantly so no one builds a loyal power base, and promotion rewards loyalty over competence. That means Saudi Arabia, the country hosting this alliance, putting up the money and the venue, is, by design, the weakest and least battle-tested military link in a pact that includes Pakistan, which fights on its own soil constantly, and Turkey, a real standing NATO force. That's not a training gap joint exercises fix in a year or 2. It's a deliberate political choice, made for regime survival reasons that predate this pact by decades, and it works directly against everything the pact claims it wants to build. None of this is the first time a grand Muslim military coalition has been announced, either. In December 2015, Saudi Arabia's defense minister at the time announced the Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition, 34 founding members, headquartered in Riyadh. That defense minister was Mohammed bin Salman himself, before he was crowned prince. The coalition grew to 43 members by 2025. In a decade, it has produced exactly 1 joint military exercise. Analysts studying it call the broader Islamic NATO concept a political myth. No integrated command, no shared doctrine, no binding commitments. Largely confined to conferences, statements, and limited coordination. Same man, same country, same playbook. Whether this pact breaks that pattern or repeats it is the actual question, not a rhetorical one. There's an even older precedent, and it has a genuine twist. In 1964, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan formed their own regional bloc, the Regional Cooperation for Development. Purely economic, not military, but the same 3-country logic. It collapsed in 1979 for a very specific reason: the Iranian Revolution. Sit with that for a second. Turkey and Pakistan's original regional partner in that seat was Iran. Decades later, they filled that same seat with Iran's principal regional rival instead. And there's a 1950 precedent too, the Arab League's Joint Defence and Economic Cooperation Treaty, with wording almost identical to the Makkah Clause. Any aggression against any signatory shall be considered aggression against other states. Its enforcement body, the Joint Arab Defense Council, hasn't functioned since 1974. Not defied exactly, just never restarted. Machinery that seized up from disuse and stayed that way. So does history suggest skepticism is warranted? Clearly. But history is arguments about what might happen. Here's what's already actually happened. The pact was signed on August 7, 2026. That same day, the day of signing, a Houthi strike wounded 11 civilians in Saudi Arabia's Najran province. A Saudi official raised concern about coordinated attacks on Saudi civilian sites. Neither Turkey nor Pakistan was reported responding or being asked to. 2 days later, August 9th, a Houthi drone hit Saudi Aramco's Jizan refinery. Fire broke out, no casualties. Aramco's own CEO called it some disruptions with no significant operational impact. And again, nothing. No statement, no mobilization from either ally. The actual headlines at the time read, "Allies yet to respond to Houthi attack on Saudi Arabia after defense pact." Now, in fairness, and this matters, because overclaiming here would undercut a genuinely strong point, no real alliance treats every provocation as a full mutual defense trigger. NATO doesn't. A single drone hitting a refinery, put out within hours with no casualties, sits closer to harassment than invasion. You don't send a fighter jet after a mosquito. Calibrated non-response to a low-tier attack is normal alliance behavior, not automatic proof the whole thing is fake. But here's the more precise claim, and it's actually the stronger one. Nobody has ever said where that threshold sits. Remember Fitton's own words, allies decide through consultations what support looks like if and when an attack happens. 2 real attacks 48 hours apart on the day of signing and 2 days later, and neither one apparently crossed whatever that undefined line is. That's not the pact is proven fake. That's the pact has an activation threshold nobody will name. And now there's real-world evidence of how high it seems to sit. And this connects to something worth remembering about Pakistan specifically. In April 2015, Pakistan's parliament refused a direct Saudi request to send troops into Yemen, a real precedent of staying close to Riyadh financially and rhetorically while declining to actually fight its wars. In 2026, the same pattern repeated twice at 2 different moments in this same story. First, Pakistan deployed 8,000 troops, a fighter squadron, and Chinese-made air defense systems to Saudi Arabia starting in early April 2026. But that deployment traces to the September 2025 bilateral deal, not this pact. And by the time Turkey signed on in August, those troops had already been sitting in the kingdom for 4 months. Second, and more tellingly, during the actual fighting of Operation Epic Fury, real Iranian and Houthi strikes landing on Saudi territory, Pakistan's jets did not deploy. They arrived April 11th, 3 days after the ceasefire, not during the war, after it. 2 data points, 11 years apart, under 2 different versions of this alliance, bilateral, then trilateral, and the pattern is identical both times. Close on paper, absent when the shooting actually starts. One more piece worth including, because it undercuts any version of this story that treats Iran as a single, unified voice reacting to the pact. It isn't. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, gave a studied non-answer, talking about Muslim states needing to stand together, without ever confirming he meant this pact specifically. Hardline voices went the opposite direction. Majlis conservative Ebrahim Razi dismissed it outright as an agreement on paper, and the conservative Daily Kayhan went further, tying it to Israeli-American cooperation. And the reformist Daily Sharg took a third position entirely, warning that dismissing this pact would be a mistake, calling it one of the most important recent security developments, and urging real diplomatic engagement instead of bravado. 3 different reactions from 3 different parts of the same government and press establishment to the same event. Iran, the country this pact is most obviously shaped around, can't agree internally on how worried to be. Start with the reactions that came fastest and least surprisingly. Israel had no official government statement in the first 24 hours, but a senior Israeli official, unnamed, told reporters plainly, "This alliance is aimed against us." Israel's Diaspora Affairs Minister Amichai Chikli went further, warning of a new axis of evil built around Qatar, Turkey, and Pakistan. And a countergrouping was floated in response, Greece, Cyprus, India, and the UAE as a kind of answering bloc. All of this is unfolding in the middle of an Israeli election campaign, with voting set for October. Worth keeping in mind as you weigh how much of what officials say publicly right now is policy, and how much is campaigning. India's Ministry of External Affairs kept it clipped, closely following developments. Two former Indian ambassadors gave more texture. Ashok Kantha called it not a positive development, while still expecting India-Saudi relations to remain strong. Venu Rajamani called it a matter of concern, requiring India to manage the relationship carefully and deftly. Measured concern, not alarm. China said almost nothing publicly, and didn't need to. Beijing had already signed a $5 billion deal in March 2026 to build a Wing Lung 3 combat drone assembly line in Jeddah, producing roughly 48 aircraft a year. A Gulf Turkey bloc operating with more independence from Washington is, for China, an opportunity, not a threat. It opens space Beijing is already positioned to fill. The United States said nothing officially either. Its presence in this story isn't a statement, it's the backdrop. Operation Epic Fury and everything before it is the reason this pact felt necessary to the people who signed it. Now here's where Israel's reaction gets more specific than a single anonymous quote. And this is worth slowing down for, because it's entirely on the record. In February 2026, 5 months before this pact existed, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett stood at the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations and said, "Turkey is the new Iran." He said Turkey and Qatar are nourishing the Islamic Brotherhood monster, called Erdogan, sophisticated, dangerous, and said Turkey is trying to flip Saudi Arabia against us and establish a hostile Sunni axis with nuclear Pakistan. Read that back. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, nuclear Pakistan, the exact 3 countries that signed this pact 5 months later. He wasn't alone. That same week, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced his own plan for a hexagon alliance to counter what he called an emerging Sunni axis, floating Greece and Cyprus as partners. And that lines up with Chikli's axis of evil, quote from a moment ago. 3 named Israeli officials, independently reaching for the same, who's next after Iran, framing in the same few weeks before the pact was even signed. It's only fair to pair that with the pushback, and the pushback notably comes from inside Israel's own foreign policy world, not from outside critics. Former Israeli ambassador Alon Pinkas, quoted arguing against the Bennett framing, put it this way: "Politicians rely on the perpetual threat of war. If it wasn't Turkey, it would be Iraq." The same reporting makes the substantive case too. Turkey has no Hezbollah-style proxy network, no Quds force, no ideology built around exporting revolution. Erdogan is a transactional populist, not a theocratic revolutionary, and treating him as Iran's equal risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy that pushes Turkey toward exactly the alignment Israel fears. 2 real, on-record positions inside the same country's foreign policy debate, both worth putting in front of you rather than picking one for you. One more piece of context, and it's important to be precise about what this is and isn't. The Gulf isn't as unified as 3 foreign ministers standing together in Mecca might suggest. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are in real, current friction. A UAE-backed militia's takeover attempt in Yemen's Hadramaut and Mara provinces in late 2025 that Saudi Arabia responded to militarily. Saudi Arabia backing Sudan's army against a UAE-backed paramilitary force that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have separately documented receiving Chinese-made weapons and foreign mercenaries through the UAE. Somalia cutting ties with the UAE altogether over its footprint in Somaliland. And separately, the Abraham Accords, Israel's 2020 normalization deal with the UAE, are fraying, not strengthening. The UAE's president called Israel's September 2025 strike on Doha crude and cowardly, and Netanyahu still hasn't been invited to the UAE 5 years after that deal was signed. To be clear about what this beat is and isn't, no source anywhere connects any of this directly to the Makkah Pact. No UAE reaction to the signing exists on record, and no analyst frames UAE's absence from it as deliberate. This isn't a hidden cause of the pact. It's a reminder that the Gulf and Israel's regional partners aren't the unified blocks they can look like from a distance. Now for the harder part, the domestic picture underneath all 3 signatories, and why it matters for how much you should trust this pact's staying power. Start with the basic structural mismatch. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. Turkey is a presidential system with a parliament. Pakistan is a civilian government operating under real military oversight. Three very different domestic political systems agreeing to defend each other. And as we already noted, none of the three put this pact through a parliamentary vote or public debate before signing it. That's worth sitting with again here. This was an executive and military decision in all three countries, not a legislated one. Each of the three has its own domestic strain, and it's worth naming specifically rather than vaguely. Turkey is coming off sustained. Nationwide protests through 2025 and into 2026, triggered by the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, Erdogan's most serious domestic rival, compounded by ongoing inflation. Among the largest protest waves Turkey has seen in over a decade. Pakistan's economy is under real strain too. Poverty sits above 40% under the newer World Bank measurement, 25% under the older one, depending which figure you see cited. A genuinely fragile domestic economy underneath a government now making a costly regional security commitment. And Saudi Arabia's MBS has his own version of this. Vision 2030's social liberalization, reopened cinemas, mixed-gender concerts, a reduced religious police, has visibly unsettled the conservative and clerical establishment at home. Part of why signing this pact specifically in Mecca, wrapped in the language of Islamic solidarity, reads as a compensating move. One claim to be precise about, though, this is not, despite what you'll see in some commentary, why Saudi Arabia has stayed out of the Abraham Accords. That's better explained by Saudi Arabia's actual stated conditions, a credible path to Palestinian statehood, and a formal U.S. defense treaty plus civil nuclear cooperation. MBS's domestic approval is generally reported as strong, not weak. Don't conflate the two arguments. Whether leadership in all three countries is currently riding high domestically, or leaning on a pact like this partly to shore up standing at home, is something the audience can weigh for themselves against everything else in this act. The protests, the poverty numbers, the social liberalization backlash. The single most useful piece of the American system isn't a monolith. Evidence doesn't require speculating about who did what behind closed doors. It's sitting in public polling and disclosed spending data. A YouGov/EMU poll from November 2025 found 42% of Republicans oppose renewing the $38 billion U.S. military aid package to Israel, against 35% in favor. And support collapses further specifically when people are reminded it's their own tax dollars, from 51% general approval down to 38%, once respondents are told where the money actually comes from. The generational divide is sharper still. The share of Republicans under 50 who view Israel unfavorably went from 35% in 2022 to 48% in March 2025 to 57% by March 2026, compared to just 24% of Republicans over 50. And this split runs straight through evangelical Christians themselves, the demographic most theologically invested in unconditional support for Israel. Evangelicals under 50, 50% unfavorable. Evangelicals over 50, 20%. A 30-point generational gap inside the group you'd expect to be most unified. Named figures are visibly driving this on the right. Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Joe Kent, Trump's own former counterterrorism director, represent a real skeptic wing. Marjorie Taylor Greene, a sitting Republican member of Congress, stepped down after calling the devastation in Gaza a genocide and demanding AIPAC register as a foreign lobbying entity. And on the other side, AIPAC's political spending is fully disclosed, public record. $231.8 million in AIPAC and pro-Israel lobbying spending, split roughly $173 million to Democrats and $58.6 million to Republicans. That's the real, sourced version of there are different elements inside the American system. No speculation required, just public numbers. One more figure worth putting on screen, stated plainly. As of this recording, UNOCHA's most recent situation report puts the death toll in Gaza at fill in current OCHA figure here before recording. That's it. Before we close, one more layer worth putting on the table, not because it's proven, but because it's real, undercovered, and directly relevant to a region that keeps producing wars nobody can quite explain with oil and borders alone. 4 separate religious traditions, each with a living end times narrative that names this exact region, and each currently held by real people with real influence over real governments. Evangelical dispensationalism reads Ezekiel chapter 38, a coalition of nations led by Gog from the land of Magog, as a prophecy about to be fulfilled, and popularly maps it onto Turkey and Iran. This isn't a fringe reading. It shapes how a real, politically significant bloc of American Christians thinks about U.S. policy toward this exact region, the same bloc whose generational split we already walked through. Religious Zionism isn't fringe, and it isn't just a private belief people hold quietly. It sits inside Israel's actual government. Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister and head of the Religious Zionism Party, wrote in his own 2017 manifesto, "I believe that the state of Israel is the beginning of our unfolding redemption," explicitly framing Jewish settlement of the biblical land as a step toward the coming of the Messiah, not just a security or political position. That belief traces back to Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook and his son Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook, whose theology held that settling and controlling this land could actively hasten redemption, the ideological root of the Gush Emunim settler movement, which grew the West Bank's settler population from roughly 0 in 1974 to around 440,000 by 2019. And this is exactly where the governments say one thing, do another pattern shows up. Smotrich has openly celebrated settlement expansion. Every settlement is another nail in the coffin of a Palestinian state, in his own words, while pursuing full annexation more quietly, through infrastructure budgets and personnel appointments rather than a formal law that would force an open political fight. Said loudly in some rooms, built quietly on the ground in others, not hidden exactly, but not always spoken the same way in every room either. The Twelver Shia belief in Imam Mahdi isn't a fringe folk belief. It's embedded in Iranian state ideology itself, shaping how elements of the Iranian establishment frame the country's role in the region. Twelver Shia Islam holds that the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, was born in the 9th century and has been in occultation, hidden by God, not dead, ever since, to return at the end of times. And here's a correction to the way this comparison usually gets made. Sunni Muslims believe in the coming of Imam Mahdi too. This isn't a Shia-only belief that Sunni Islam somehow skipped. It's a mainstream Sunni belief as well, attested across multiple hadith collections. The real difference between the two traditions isn't whether the Mahdi is coming. Both say he is, it's who and when. Shia belief holds he was already born, is a specific named individual, and has been hidden away for over 1,000 years. Sunni belief holds he hasn't been born yet, that he'll appear near the end of times, grow up as an ordinary, unremarkable man, not recognized by anyone, and only be identified as the Mahdi later, through a political crisis. A dispute among rival claimants after the death of a ruler, from which he's drawn out and given the pledge of allegiance against his own will. One widely circulated hadith, Sunan Abu Dawud 4286, describes an army sent from Syria to fight him being swallowed by the earth in the desert between Mecca and Medina. Like a number of narrations within the hadith sciences, scholars have differed on this one's chain of transmission over the centuries, some grading it weak, others, including Ibn al-Qayyim, judging it sound. That kind of disagreement over a specific narration's chain is normal within Islamic scholarship, and it's worth remembering the same category of question, which accounts of an event are reliably transmitted, and which aren't applies to every religious tradition's texts, not just this one. The broader belief in the Mahdi's coming itself isn't in that same disputed category. It rests on considerably stronger ground across Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, and Tirmidhi. And per the tradition, he isn't described as personally righteous before that moment either, an ordinary man, by some accounts genuinely unremarkable, until God changes his heart, virtually overnight. Only after that comes al-Malhama al-Kubra, the great battle Sunni Islam's own name for the end times war, a real recognized category within the hadith sciences. The core hadith, found in Sahih Muslim 2899, describes Muslims and Rome forming a temporary alliance against a common enemy, which then collapses into a final battle, located in the Hadith at Dabik or Alamak in northern Syria. After that comes the Dajjal, Islam's Antichrist equivalent figure, who the now recognized Mahdi leads the fight against. Then the return of Isa, peace be upon him, who descends near Damascus and delivers the final defeat. And after that, Yajuj wa Majuj, Gog and Magog. Sit with that name for a second, because it isn't a coincidence of translation. The same two names, Gog and Magog, appear independently in the evangelical tradition we just covered and in Islamic eschatology. In the Quran, not just Hadith, Surah Al-Kahf 18:94, where the people ask Dhul-Qarnayn to build a barrier against Gog and Magog, corruptors in the land, and Surah Al-Anbiya 21:96, where their release is named as a sign the day of judgment is near. Two of these four traditions, developed independently, centuries and continents apart, name the exact same apocalyptic figures. Here's why this isn't just trivia. In 2014, ISIS named its official propaganda magazine Dabik, directly after that hadith. They read this prophecy not as scripture to reflect on, but as an instruction to act on, and built a recruitment and self-mythologizing campaign around dragging the world toward that final battle by force. That's what happens when any one of these four traditions gets treated as something to hasten rather than something to leave in God's hands. So here's where I'll land on this plainly as my own view. The mistake isn't any one of these four traditions. Each is a real, sincerely held belief within a real religious community, and each deserves to be described accurately rather than mocked or flattened. The mistake, shared across all four, not unique to any single one, is impatience. It's the temptation to reach for the ending yourself instead of trusting the timing to God. Every one of these traditions, read carefully within its own scripture, actually counsels patience and submission to divine timing, not a countdown clock for human hands to start. Let God decide. Not politicians, not generals, not anyone claiming to speak for him. So back to where we started. 3 foreign ministers standing in Mecca, promising to defend each other because, increasingly, it looked like nobody else would. 34 years of warnings, 3 wars, 1 betrayed mediator, and a missile finally landing on Saudi soil. That's the chain that produced this pact. On that much, the record is completely clear. Whether the promise itself means anything is a different question, and this is where I'll be honest rather than tidy about the answer. Right now, the evidence says it hasn't been tested and passed. It's been tested and gone silent, twice, within 48 hours of signing, against attacks small enough that a calibrated non-response is defensible, but real enough that somebody should have said something. It's echoing a structure, the IMCTC, that the same man built once before and that produced, in a decade, 1 joint exercise and a great many conferences. And it's asking 2 governments with a documented, repeated history of staying close on paper while declining to send their own soldiers, to now do exactly that if the moment ever actually comes. None of that proves the pact is empty. Analysts give arrangements like this roughly 12 to 18 months to show whether they're becoming something real, a functioning secretariat, joint exercises, an actual named threshold for when the clause activates, or whether they're settling into what so many of these announcements before it became, a signing ceremony that photographs well and asks nothing of anyone. And it's worth remembering that security pacts have, historically, occasionally grown into something much bigger than the security clause itself. NATO, formed in 1949, didn't by itself create the European Union. The actual seed of European integration, the coal and steel community, was signed 2 years later in 1951, driven by French and German reconciliation, not by NATO's mutual defense clause. But the two grew up together, reinforcing each other for decades, a security guarantee stable enough that former enemies could risk economic integration without fearing another war on the continent. Decades later, that produced a shared parliament, a shared market, and eventually a shared currency. Nobody signed a single document in 1949 that planned all of that. It grew slowly because the underlying relationship was real. Whether Riyadh, Ankara, and Islamabad are at the beginning of something like that, or whether this stays a signing ceremony and little else, isn't a question this video can answer for you. It's genuinely too early to know. I'm not going to resolve that for you with more confidence than the evidence actually supports. That restraint is itself the most honest closing argument available here. A pact this loudly announced has, so far, been tested twice and said nothing. What it becomes next is still unwritten. Whether that changes is not going to be decided by anything said in this video. It's going to be decided the next time someone tests it for real.